The modern Republic of India was born in 1947. But the country had been awakened 50 years earlier, above all by a somewhat eccentric English woman of whom it's been said that no single person did so much to revive the Hindu's pride in his religious heritage as she. She was Annie Besant, whose strange career began in the 1870s. Born Annie Wood, the daughter of a poor but genteel widow, she'd been given only a meagre education. At 19, full of devotion to Christ and desire to serve, she had done what everyone assured her was the obvious thing. She married a clergyman, Frank Besant, and went with him to a country parish in Lincolnshire. In the villages around Sibsey, she encountered the terrible sufferings of the rural poor.
In one cottage, I'd found 4 generations sleeping in one room. The great-grandfather and his wife, the unmarried grandmother, the unmarried mother, the little child. And 3 men lodgers completed the tale of 8 human beings crowded into that narrow, ill-ventilated garret. Other cottages were hovels, through the broken roofs of which poured the rain, and wherein rheumatism and ague lived with the human dwellers. How could I do aught but sympathize with any combination of workers that aimed at the raising of these poor?
The conditions of the poor, and then the long and distressing illness of her own first child, undermined her belief in the justice of life. In addition, her husband appears to have been a brute, and her marriage was failing. Annie Besant began to lose her faith.
The agony of the struggle was in the first 19 months. No one who has not felt it knows the fearful anguish inflicted by doubt on the earnestly religious soul. It seems to shipwreck everything. Is all blind chance? Is all the clash of unconscious forces? Or are we the sentient toys of an almighty power that sports with our agony?
Annie Besant had an active, inquiring spirit. She wanted answers, she wanted activity. The narrowness and frustration of a married woman's life in a remote country village at that time was intolerable to her. She worried about the Bible, she worried about human suffering, about Christ's punishment, about hell. By reading liberal theologians, she managed to ease herself out of the harsh, old evangelical beliefs she'd been brought up in. But the respite was only temporary. Her thoughts at this time were moving in a humanist direction. One day she locked herself in the church and then, feeling rather foolish, climbed the pulpit to try out her speaking voice. What had she to say?
What is your hope? A heaven in the clouds? I point to a heaven attainable on earth. What? You serve warmly a God unknown and invisible, in a sense only the projected shadow of your own imaginings, and can only serve coldly your brother whom you see at your side. If you want inspiration to feeling, to sentiment, perhaps you'd better keep to your Bible and your creeds. But if you want inspiration to work, go and walk through the east of London or the back streets of Manchester. You're inspired to tenderness as you gaze at the wounds of Jesus dead in Judea long ago. And yet you find no inspiration in the wounds of men and women dying in the England of today. I offer you ideals for your homage. Here is truth for your mistress, to whose exaltation you shall devote your intellect. Here is freedom for your general, for whose I shall never forget the feeling of power and of delight which came upon me as my voice rolled down the aisles and the passion in me broke into balanced sentences. I felt that all I wanted was to see the church full of upturned faces instead of the emptiness of the silent pews. And as though in a dream, the solitude became peopled, and I saw the listening faces and the eager eyes. And as the sentences came unbidden from my lips, and my own tones echoed back to me from the pillars of the ancient church, I knew of a verity, that the gift of speech was mine.
Only a century ago, it was still very difficult for a woman to imagine that she could be a public speaker. A few months later, the crisis came. Annie Besant, the vicar's wife, sitting here, did not go up to receive communion, but stood and walked out of the church instead. This was scandalous and open revolt, because any wife, but above all a vicar's wife, was of course expected to be entirely behind her husband. So there was an ultimatum. She must conform or she must leave home. But now it was far too late to bring her back into line. By the end of 1873, at the age of 26, Mrs. Besant was legally separated from her husband and living in poverty with her 2 babies in Upper Norwood, London. Now her energies were released. She joined the National Secular Society and met Charles Bradlaugh, the celebrated atheist campaigner. She became co-editor with Bradlaugh of his newspaper, published from this address in Fleet Street. It's still a newspaper office today.
Okay. Cheers.
Annie Besant's activity as a militant atheist campaigner was phenomenal. She was assailed at public meetings all over the country, and she poured out tracts and articles. Her interest in marriage and the condition of women led to the famous test case on the right to publish birth control information, which she and Bradlaugh fought before the Lord Chief Justice in 1877. They won on appeal, but it cost her the custody of her children, for another court ruled that her views made her unfit to care for them. With Bradlaugh, she also fought the long legal battles over his admission to Parliament, and in those same years, she managed to read a science degree at London University. She was a fighter. Annie Besant was already moving away from Bradlaugh's rather sectarian atheism. She was now an active socialist. She was in the bloody demonstration in Trafalgar Square on November the 13th, 1877, when socialist marchers were met by mounted police and guardsmen with fixed bayonets. Still, Annie Besant's unquiet spirit was not at rest. Perhaps her militant atheism and socialism had taken her too far from her mother and her upbringing. At any rate, she was already dabbling in spiritualism when, one day in 1889, a book came in for her to review. It was H.P. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine. She was ripe for conversion.
I was sitting alone at my desk in the Reformer office, immersed in a deep but nearly hopeless longing to solve the riddle of life and mind, when I heard a voice speaking to me. I could see nobody, but the voice said, "Are you willing to give up everything for the sake of truth?" I didn't challenge him or ask questions. I wanted the truth, that was the fact. I was longing to have it intensely. So I went head over heels into the secret doctrine. I'm immersed in Madame Blavatsky. If I perish in the attempt to review her, you must write on my tomb, "She has gone to investigate the secret doctrine at first hand."
Mrs. Besant's conversion to Theosophy astonished the public. Theosophists believed that Madame Blavatsky was telepathically guided by Tibetan masters, and Annie herself came to think she'd been a Hindu in a previous life. How had she jumped from atheism and socialism straight into such ideas? Well, Theosophy was very vigorous and attractive. It appealed to people who were in revolt against narrow, outworn creeds. It offered them a higher teaching, the wisdom of the East, an ancient universal truth that underlay all religions alike. And this was just what Annie wanted. Now, in those paradoxical days when so many of the British were looking to India for religious inspiration, talented young Indians were being sent to Britain to learn the ways of their imperial rulers. In 1890, the two groups met. Gandhi was a young law student in London.
Towards the end of my second year in England, I met two theosophists. They introduced me to Madame Blavatsky and Mrs. Besant. The latter had just joined the Theosophical Society, and I was following with great interest the controversy about her conversion. I also read The Key to Theosophy, which stimulated me to read books on Hinduism, and disabused me of the notion fostered by the missionaries that Hinduism was rife with superstition.
Gandhi was profoundly influenced all his life by the teaching of Jesus, especially his concern for the deprived. But when he and Mrs. Besant went to India, they went as apostles not of Christianity and British culture, but of a renaissance of Hinduism. Her 30 years campaigning there prepared the way for his eventual triumph.